Welcome to Chapter 4, From the Classical to the Hellenistic World, 400 to 30 BCE. When we left off in our last chapter, it was a period of crisis, right? We had the Peloponnesian Wars, which stretched on for a ridiculously long time in the Greek world. That war had really challenged many of the systems of government by eroding the unity of the city-states that we saw during the Persian War under the Hellenistic League. That broke down into the Hellenic and Delian League, which broke down further as these two entities warred with each other and with Persia off and on. The results of this massive amount of war, the debt that it created, the social disruption it caused for people, even the physical disruption it caused for people, is going to be such a big problem that it's going to create a kind of crisis in the Greek idea of self. Because all of those notions of arete, what made Greece excellent, were really challenged during this period. By the end of it, our great leader of the polis, Pericles, the creator of radical democracy, himself had died from the plague that ravaged Athens as it was sieged during the war. When the war ended, there was a period of 30 tyrants in Athens, which had a number of cartels and powerful leaders take over in the power vacuum, some of which were not the worst of leaders. Most of them were pretty violent, though. So this was a violent period. So too was a period of civil war. And we're going to see the consequences of that disruption and that disunity in the Greek world in this chapter with the rise of a brand new power. So let's think about the major themes for this chapter. Of course, war, war, war. From the Peloponnesian to the 30 tyrant to the Civil War period, there's lots and lots of war. War on the streets of Athens, where during the 30 tyrants period, people were knifing each other in the streets, as we discussed in chapter 3. We're going to see all of those soldiers that have been sent off to fight wars come back to find that there is no place for them. There's nothing for them to do now. The war is over. They aren't going to get any housing. They aren't going to get any land grants. So what we see is a lot of them turn into mercenary soldiers if they hadn't already by the Peloponnesian War. One of the consequences of that that's going to lead us into this chapter is that those mercenary soldiers are going to take tactical information like we discussed in chapter 3 with Xenophon. They're going to take tactical information to other great powers, and we'll see one of these new powers rise in the form of Macedonia. We're going to see a lot of displacement of people. We're going to see cities overcrowded. We're going to see a lot of people trying to pull in from the countryside to escape the ravages of war, especially when the Spartans were kind of tearing through the countryside and burning things down. We're going to see those folks try to move their way into the city to be protected. We're going to see then the public space filled with people in temporary homes, homes that they have to set up in the public forum that used to be reserved for people to speak and discuss the nature of politics and philosophy. Now those areas are going to be occupied by the displaced and the poor. But we're not just going to see the public space itself eroding. We're going to see the ideals behind it. The ideals behind democracy are challenged by this great war, and we're going to see a number of the consequences for that in this chapter. When the Macedonians come in and take advantage of the disruption and disunity of the Greek world, they too are going to wage some serious warfare. A warfare of conquer and conquest. And there's going to be a whole heck of a lot of expansion in the Greek world. When the Macedonians come in under first Philip and then his son Alexander, we're going to see and the Greek world open up to other cultures in a way that it had not before. Because one thing we discussed quite a lot was how this regional sense of identity and competition tied to that Greek notion of arete promoted people thinking of themselves as special and being somewhat enclosed in their world. The war had forced many soldiers out there into the world. It had displaced people, but we're now going to see the exposure to other cultures be a part of expansion as the Macedonian leadership introduces more ideas and cultures into that tiny little bubbled space of the Greek world. But sadly, we're also going to see that Alexander leaves no successor. And because of that, there's going to be a series of succession wars that end with the Hellenistic kingdoms being broken up into his great generals who then take over different portions of the Hellenistic kingdoms, each setting up their own kind of states, some of which fare very well and last for a while, some of which fall very quickly to other invading forces. Especially when we get into Rome, we'll see that Rome takes advantage of some of this and themselves goes and conquers some of these fledgling Hellenistic kingdoms. But really what these kingdoms are going to do is they're going to transform the culture of Greece. Greece's art, its aesthetics, its philosophies, its idea of identity are all going to be challenged by these multicultural exchanges with this new expanded Greek world. We're also going to see a lot of innovations in things like medicine, in science, right? In philosophy, in history, in poetry, in art forms. And we're going to see that with the kingdoms come the end of the polis, and with it the end of radical democracy. People really, by the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, don't really mind the end of that democracy, as we shall see here in a moment. And we're going to see new powers arise as a result in the Mediterranean at this time. Now, one place that we can really already see the transition period, the challenges to that Greek idea of polis, is some of these figures that we started thinking about in our last chapter, especially Socrates, which is pretty germane to what we think about in our primary source analysis of Xenophon in his Socratic texts, right? Because we know a bit about Socrates. We know a bit about why he was challenging as a thinker. A big reason why he was challenging is because he did highlight, as so many philosophers of this age did, some of the issues that we brought up in chapter 2 and chapter 3 in the Greek ideology. One of the big ones being the tricky nature of the gods. The fact that Hesiod's theogony didn't really lay down a significant moral standard that people were meant to follow by the gods, but instead had gods often behaving badly and in petty and petulant ways. We see some of that confusion expressed by some of these philosophers at this time of crisis. Socrates was definitely one of them, because he challenged the notion that the fates or the gods are what set our ideas of what is right and what is wrong. And he instead sought to connect ideas of right and wrong to some universal nature, a universal ethical standard that we could arrive at through the act of questioning our beliefs and our practices and seeing when they ally in a logical way with our viewpoints as a culture. This was, of course, as we discussed in last chapter, a little bit difficult for people, and this became even more so under the period of the 30 tyrants, because Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were all people who were patroned. They had patron supporters in one of the tyrants. In the case of Socrates, that was Critias. Critias was a tyrant. He was a powerful man. As far as powerful men's men go, though, he was a pretty decent one. He was a pretty fair and even-handed ruler. Yet nonetheless, people found the idea of a tyrant somewhat difficult at this time. And what also really made the tension that thinkers like Socrates created even greater was what happened after the period of the 30 tyrants in the Civil War, when people in Greece sought to sustain an order out of the chaos. And one of the ways that they did that as the 30 tyrant period passed was by enacting a series of amnesties. The idea here was that people who did things because they were working for a tyrant at this period could not be held responsible for that and punished. They couldn't be banished or exiled or put to death for supporting a tyrant, the idea being so many people had to, and times were so uncertain that the best way to move forward and make sure that the Greek world prospered was to not kill any more people off unnecessarily. But that's a difficult thing to do in a society that's in crisis because people want to blame somebody, and they certainly did, especially in Athens. So if you can't come up with a really good reason by saying, hey, he was supported by this tyrant, hey, I think that he's part of the problem because he doesn't reflect our old Athenian Golden Age values, then they would come up with something else. In the case of Socrates, they came up with basically the idea that he had subverted the gods, that he had gone against the will of the gods. And as such, they actually, according to some sources, because as we noted, Socrates wrote nothing down, and we have more than one account of Socrates' death and his execution, and they do not all match, by the way, in terms of what the story is. Everybody has a little bit of a different take. Everybody has a little bit of a different perspective. People tend to take Plato's most seriously because Plato was a student of Socrates, and he did some of the first and the most extensive of the Socratic work writing of that time period. And in his account, Socrates is banished, and Socrates finds the idea of being exiled from Athens so hideous, so untoward, that he would prefer to die than to be banished. He asks for the hemlock himself and poisons himself rather than being kicked out of the city-state that he loves. That's the story, at least. Now, whether or not that's true is, something historians will likely argue about ad nauseum until the end of time, as we historians do. But what the story reflects is Plato's own consternation at his position, because Plato was himself under the patronage of a tyrant. He himself wrote many works that were much less democratically allied than we saw in the work of Socrates. Plato and Aristotle both really reflected a changing value. Aristotle's going to reflect that even more because Aristotle's going to transition us into the next period. But Plato is very much a creature of the 30 tyrants in the Civil War. And what his work really represents is this new kind of concept emerging out of the ashes of the Peloponnesian War, that democracy is not particularly a good thing. And if you see Plato's philosophy, you see that expressed in the Republic especially, because what he promotes there is not a democracy. It's the rule of philosopher kings, philosopher tyrants. The very, very wise who are the most learned and who themselves will surround themselves with advisors and philosophers, hint, hint, like me, Plato, who will give them good advice, right? These folks can do the best job of leading the people. And in the Republic, he very much supports a notion of hierarchy, which is what we really see on the rise in the 30 Tyrants period. And we can see much of his philosophy kind of unfold from this moment. Perhaps showing Socrates dying rather than being exiled was his way of symbolically capturing the end of the polis. Who's to say? I like to think that that's what it is because it's poetic and beautiful. But we don't really particularly know, but we'll argue about it forever. What we don't have to argue about is some of his ideas that he wrote down. He did believe in a sense of absolute reality. There was no relativity, right? We talked about the sophists and the way they discussed that there was different moments that held different truths. He did not believe there are different truths. There is one absolute truth that we arrived at by society through a series of dialogues with each other. And that's the way that he liked to translate most of his work, is through dialogues. So people talking, which was similar to what we saw in Socrates, but didn't feature quite so many questions, which is actually pretty apropos considering he was a more hardline thinker. He did also, though, believe that there was a series of forms. These were inherent and God-given, gods rather, plural, given forms that dictated behavior and the way the universe worked. Certain natural things that occurred in our universe occurred that way because the gods set them to be that way. This is a very metaphysical concept. This is something that exists outside of the body. But it might be also noted that he believed that there was a dualism between the mind and the body. And when we discussed a little bit earlier, one of the common critiques for one of our book writers who is a translator is that he uses the word soul when most translators these days use the word mind. The idea being that it's thought. It's not something that is spiritual. It's not some greater than being that exists outside of yourself that goes on after you die. No, your mind is something that you craft and it dies with you. So this is not really the soul, the concept of the soul with all of the cultural baggage we would attach to it now. But he did believe that the mind and the body were separate things. It functions separately, right? So it wasn't just that there was a brain somewhere in there and that's where the mind was. His philosophy of mind put higher thought and consciousness past a mere physical form. And that's considered dualism. Plato also was an avid teacher. And because he had the patronage of the 30 tyrant, he was able to establish his own school that he could teach people in called the Academy. There people would learn astronomy, mathematics, political philosophy, and that notion of metaphysics, right, that we were just talking about. So he really explored more than just the mind and thoughts and feelings. He was very much interested in some of those forms that we were talking about in last chapter that were beginning to emerge at this time. Science, medicine, astronomy, mathematics. There's all these advancements taking place that became a part of his structured learning academy. And Plato really represented that democracy brought us down mindset that people had in the Peloponnesian War. Just as much as he represented that idea, Aristotle represented the idea that we'll see for the rest of this chapter, because Aristotle is going to take us into the Macedonian period. Aristotle is probably most famously the teacher of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great's tutor was Aristotle, according to the legend and the myth. It's hard sometimes to separate legend and myth from fact at this time period, and as we've noted a couple times already in this class, one big problem with this time period is that many of the primary sources that we had, many of those sources of evidence that we had, burned down with the Library of Alexandria to historians' great dismay to this time period. We still get a certain kind of historical ennui whenever we think about the Alexandrian Library burning down. But Aristotle took some of those ideas that we saw from Plato and added to them a little bit more according to the changing ideas that we see in this time period. He too believed that the educated should be the rulers. He believed that citizens should be moderate. So the most moderate people from society should be given citizenship. If people were too unruly, they should be denied that, and they shouldn't be a part of any political or thought process in society because they're only bound to dredge it down. He too established a school to teach people in called the Lyceum. There, he really focused on logic and scientific inquiry, and we're going to see some of the changes that happen in the Hellenistic period that really make science a much bigger field of study in Aristotle's day. He believed very much too in observation, the act of observation, more than metaphysical forms that exist created by the gods. He really believed in this kind of act of observing the natural world and using practical experience to come to a logical conclusion. And we'll see in this chapter the way Aristotle is going to reflect the changing values of the Hellenistic world. Because the Peloponnesian War created so much discord, so much disunity, Macedonia was able to rise and take over. But let's talk a little bit about Macedonia itself. Where did these guys come from? Because nobody really heard of them or talked about them much up until the period when they started taking everything over. And it wasn't just from the Greeks, it was also from the Persians, because the Persians also took a number of losses. You know, all those mercenary soldiers going back and forth from one guy to another, from the Persians to the Greeks, from the Spartans to the Athenians. This kind of behavior meant that a lot of people suffered under the Peloponnesian War in a way that Macedonia could take advantage of. Let's kind of get a baseline understanding of these folks. They operated under a monarchy, so there was a king. However, people were free to speak their mind. There was, in fact, these large halled gatherings, so about once every 2 to 4 months or something, people would be called into the great hall and they would meet with the king and they would speak their grievances. They would ask for justice on this matter or that matter, and they wouldn't be harmed for that act, or at least that was the way it was supposed to work. Of course, in history, the way that the rules work in application, it's not always as lovely as it is on paper. And I'm sure there was limits to what people could speak in public, but by and large, there was a pretty good freedom of speech. Now, the king, though, kept their power by keeping the social elite kind of played off each other. And that's what the Macedonian kings did to keep their position of power. They would take the elites and they would give favors to one and then pull favors away from the other and sow discord between those two houses, so that it'd be so busy fighting with each other that they wouldn't take over power from the king. And the freedom of speech that was given to even people who were not elite gave kings the ability to also kind of set the non-elite and the elite off each other as well, to their benefit. One other thing is that women were very, very powerful in this system because they controlled marriage and marriage alliances. In marriage alliances, as well as succession, I might add, marriage alliances and succession are the name of the game when you're in a monarchy. Now, Macedonians, despite the fact that Greeks didn't really see Macedonians as part of the Greek world, Macedonians really did see themselves as part of the Greek world, and we can kind of see why if we look at this map, can't we? I mean, we know that Thrace was considered a part of the Greek world. We know that Epirus was considered part of the Greek world, so why not Macedonia? Thessaly was. I mean, they were all so close together. The idea that they weren't Greek was not something that passed over the minds of the Macedonians. They may have been largely ignored by the Greeks, but they considered themselves very much allied with this idea of Greekness, right? And they felt that they belonged in some way, shape, or form to this culture. And we'll see the way that that plays out when Alexander the Great becomes the leader after his father and very much promotes himself as the best Greek person possible. So it should be noted that the Macedonians considered themselves Greeks, and some of the folks around them also considered them Greeks. So it was really just certain people in certain city-states that didn't. Hint, hint, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, you know, the big names from our past few chapters, who tended to put themselves on a step ladder above everyone else. Now, Philip II was really the conqueror who made that first great conquering push into the Greek city-states after the Peloponnesian War. And just looking at his picture, you can really get an idea of the fact that the man was a military leader. And in fact, military leadership was part of the way that you became a successful monarch in Macedonia, which allied them very much with certain Spartan traditions especially. And one could definitely say there was a lot in common between the Spartans and the Macedonians. And in fact, the Spartans are much more happy with the leadership of the Macedonians than they ever were with the leadership of the Athenians, and for good reason. I mean, look at this king. He lost an eye in battle. His face was just, by all accounts, streaked with various scars. And even when and by the way, this picture that we have up here is based on a recreation that people did from his death mask. So that's pretty cool. Death masks were really popular since the Agamemnian time period. So we see a lot of death masks in the Greek world at this time. And an artist went ahead and did this wonderful kind of recreation of what his face would have looked like based on this death mask. And this is basically what they came to between that and a few descriptions and texts, etc. Now, one thing that the Macedonians excelled at, but Philip excelled at the most, was very innovative tactics. Philip introduced the mobile spear-bearing phalanx combined with cavalry, right? So we already had the phalanx and we had spear bearers, but what he did is he combined them all with a cavalry unit that was a little bit different than what we saw in any of the rest of the Greek world, not even in Sparta, and it was an incredibly successful model. He conquered very quickly, and he tended to conquer even armies that outnumbered his own. But more than that, Philip knew when to use diplomacy and when to use military force and when to use the other great tool of statecraft, bribery. He really knew how to play the Greek city-states, and as we discussed in the last chapter, during the Peloponnesian War and the 30 Tyrants period, it was very easy to kind of manipulate the Greek city-states because they were in such a state of disarray and were so hell-bent on getting each other that they weren't really worried about this fellow Philip at the door. He also, though, when he starts invading these Greek city-states, bribing them, using diplomacy to add them onto his empire, to get them on his side, he invades a bunch of Persian territory very successfully. And the Persians have been that classical Greek enemy. So that really gets a lot of people on his side. We see this especially at the Battle of Chaeronea. Athens and Thebes unite in an alliance for a very short period of time to keep Philip at bay. But not many people are supporting them at that point because he did such a good job of defeating the Persians. And because of that, Philip was able to have a much more powerful and peopled alliance, and thus was able to be successful. However, just as Philip was coming to the aegis of his success, he was assassinated in 336 BCE. There's a few theories about who assassinated Philip II and why. Probably one of the more popular ones is that it was Alexander's mother, because Alexander's mother was in the process of being divorced by Philip II, and he was about to marry another woman who he'd had a child with and declare that child his successor. That would have cut her son out and would have opened both herself and her son up to assassination by his new wife and their entourage. So it's possible. There's a lot of really great sources out there that discuss this, whether or not this was a plot by her, whether it was someone else. It's hard to say. The records really don't clearly indicate one way or the other, and it's like most all assassinations, there's always going to be conspiracies. And here's that excellent military innovation. You see those spears going up, right? Those long spears with the army, the phalanx army, right? But you also see it's the way he planned his battle formation, right? And Alexander the Great added a little bit to this, but he really used a successful battle formation. You see the diversity of his troops. You know, he has skirmishers, he has irregular folks, he has a light cavalry, he has a heavy cavalry, right? All of this means that he's really intensifying battle and making it more particular to the kinds of battles he sees. And this is one particular battle formation. And sometimes he could be somewhat more flexible with the way he utilized these different battle types. But this tended to be the way he would attack. And this was like nothing the Greeks had seen before, not even under the Spartans, those masters of military tactic. And this is really what made not just Philip II successful, but his son Alexander, who succeeded him. Alexander III, otherwise known, of course, as Alexander the Great, succeeded the throne after a bit of a battle, because it was a bit of a battle to get him in the throne, and he had to kill a few of his competitors for that succession to do so. But when he takes the throne, he almost immediately goes to war with Thebes and Persia, crushing the last of that resistance. We were talking about the Theban and the Athenian alliance. He crushes the last of that Theban presence and invades even more of Persia, in so doing winning even more of the support of the Greeks. And he also introduces some new tactics in addition to the ones that his father did, most especially when it came to siege warfare and that technology, because we remember that was Athens' big thing. Keep that siege up, depend on your naval power. The way he broke the siege was not by trying to confront them on the sea, but to build better things to break those city walls, or to get over it, or to launch plagued and infected animals into the city. And that's why we see the development of catapults, of stone piers, of battering rams. All of these things made him highly, highly successful as he defeated the last of his enemies in the Greek world, and even farther still as we go along here. One thing that he learned from the Persians and that he took to heart and used as part of his innovative form of administration was that satrap, the satrapy that we discussed from the Persians, right? That great dense military or administrative unit that you could use in a large and dispersed kingdom and empire. We didn't really need that when we were, Athens. We don't really need a satrapy when your city-state is the only place that you're administering, right? But you definitely need it if you're expanding, and expanding and conquering was the name of the game for Alexander. Now, he also used this concept of hegemony, the idea being, I am the one ruler, yes, but you all are city-states and you're all cities and municipalities with your own independent rule. So you'd say, okay, you keep your system of governance, just like the satrapi did, right? You keep your system of governance and laws. You just follow these one set rules that I've laid down that makes you a part of my larger hegemony. And we'll all be kosher. That's the way he ran his kingdom, and it was his kingdoms, and it was very, very successful as an empire model. Now, in addition to using beating the Persians as a great way to get the Greeks on board, he also used a lot of that Greek heroic mythology. Remember those hero cults that we discussed? You know, Heracles as a hero, otherwise known to us now as Hercules. He himself wore the lion helmet of Heracles into battle. This would be understood by people in the Greek world and was a part of how we see him express his idea of Greek belonging. He wore this to show people that he was of Greece, but also to ally him with their great hero myths, because he really saw himself as a heroic figure, as a son of God walking the earth. But he also used Persian symbols, especially when he was in Persian areas. He used the Persian sun, right, around him to represent that idea of Ahura Mazda from the Persian myths. So he used that as well. So he crafted and created a spectacle of his person that would use symbols familiar to the people he was conquering, and would get them really excited and jazzed about him as a leader, because he would be representing things they understood and already believed fervently in. But perhaps one of his greatest gifts as a leader is that he understood the importance of keeping the military happy. And if there is anything that the military needed after the Peloponnesian Wars and the 30 Tyrants period, what we talked about when we were in that chapter 3 discussion of Xenophon. Why mercenary soldiers? Well, because there wasn't much that they could do outside of that. And it was a hard life, a displaced life, a roaming life. So what he did is he really crafted a very, very intense and complex system of loyalty and gifting to his military to keep them on his side. He was a very powerful battle leader. He went into battle himself every time, usually at the front of the battle, and it's really that kind of gung-ho nature that will eventually be his demise. But it really, at the beginning, got him the support of many military leaders that had for too long, especially those Athenians, who for too long were being led off into war by men who themselves never fought, and then coming back to find that there was nothing for them. He amended this situation by being a part and being one with his military generals especially, and by gifting them lands. They in turn would inspire loyalty in their troops and gift their troops lands and booty and all of that good stuff, and also powerful marriage alliances with foreign leaders. This was a big deal. They could go off and travel for a really long way, land in another country, and be like, hey, I'm going to marry this powerful woman with lots of money, and now I got land and riches and booty. Awesome. He really paid his soldiers up, and that's the way that he was able to remain popular for so very long in a way that the Greek city-states had not. And we can see how very, very important that loyalty is when we see just how much land he conquered and how far and wide his campaigns stretched. Because we see that he went all the way over here into the north of India, into modern day Afghanistan, and into parts of the Caucasus Mountains, And all the way over here, right, and all the way over here into Egypt, right, we're going to have the Ptolemaic kingdoms established out of this. He went really far and he went really wide in a very short period of time. So having troop loyalty is pretty important. However, the great distance will in fact be one of the things that leads to his downfall, because it's one thing to get land and booty, but it's another thing to be at war and be marching for 4 years straight. It starts to wear you out. And that's in fact what we're going to see be a serious problem for Alexander as his reign stretches on. And it especially becomes a problem because Alexander himself may or may not have fallen ill by being exposed to one of the many bizarre things that you're going to be exposed to when you go into other nations and areas with very different climates and plant life and bacteria and viruses and people than the ones that you came from. And the sad part about this is that Alexander was so busy conquering and so busy setting up these administrative units and so busy setting up his spectacle and spreading that far and wide, spreading the myth of Alexander, that he didn't really spend much time thinking about succession. And here we see this with Diodorus Siculus, a historian and contemporary to Alexander, who wrote, "When Alexander was quitting life in Babylon, and at his last breath was asked by his friends to whom he was leaving his kingdom, he said, 'To the best man, for I foresee that a great combat of my friends will be my funeral games.' And this actually happened. For after the death of Alexander, the foremost of his friends quarreled about the primacy and joined in many great combats." And that is, in fact, exactly what happened upon Alexander's death. The generals went to war with each other over who would have his lands and how they would split it up. And you can see that it took a few years for them to figure this out. And what they ended up coming to was that they would split the kingdoms down amongst the greatest of generals, the ones that won out in these wars of succession that followed Alexander's death. And we have 3 really major kingdoms and a few kind of smaller ones that weren't quite as large, weren't quite successful, and weren't quite as enduring. We had Antigonus the general take over in Anatolia, the Near East, Macedonia, and Greece. He was a real leader there. That was a general that won the day in that battle. Then we saw the general Seleucus, who took over Babylonia, parts of the kind of east of India, and parts of modern-day Afghanistan. Then we see the Ptolemaic, run by Ptolemy, one of his generals. He took over Egypt and Transjordan, and we still tend to use the word Ptolemaic a whole heck of a lot to talk about the Egyptians in this time period. Many of them were run by these kind of Greek folks that were brought over during the Hellenistic kingdoms. And we're going to see this a few times in coming chapters when we talk about the Ptolemies. This is actually going to be one of the more lasting of the kingdoms from the Hellenistic era. Then we see a few other kind of spread out kingdoms, the Attalids, the Parthians, the Bactrians, the Pergamenes, that Pergamene empire that people tend to hear about. That's really from the Attalids. And that's going to expand and contract during different time periods. Though some of this we won't really cover too much in this class because it goes really too far east to be of much concern for the Western world. With these leaders came a kind of new social hierarchy. It began with Alexander, but it definitely was perpetuated under his generals. They set up monarchies, right? We saw in the Greek world, we saw kind of urban Greek culture mixed with kind of Macedonian elite concepts of social hierarchy in mores and behaviors. So some of those Macedonian habits kind of melded in with the Greek world that had been established in urban centers like in Athens and in Corinth and in Sparta, most especially in Atticus. So we also see the continuation of that satrap administration. We see a lot of kind of local lords and princes that take over and rule as time moves on. But what we're really going to see is an expanded series of trade networks and trade hierarchies, right? We're going to see more merchants come into the fray now that there's more stability to a point, more stability than there was under the Peloponnesian Wars. And all of those satrap systems that Alexander set up really lasted after his death in the form of more normalized trade networks. So we're going to see a mercantile kind of explosion under Alexander that outlasts his lifetime. We're going to see a lot of free laborers. And we're going to see, of course, a lot of rural farmers. So all of those subaltern people, you know, the poorer folks, the peasants, and of course, as per usual, because it doesn't seem like we can get many periods of history where we aren't discussing it, we're going to see slaves. Some of those slaves will be slaves that are used in households as servants, as tutors, like we saw in the last couple of chapters. And we're also going to see some slaves put to work, as we saw in Sparta, in things like mining. If you were a slave, you really hope to not be a miner. It's pretty much the dirtiest, nastiest, most fatal of jobs one could have as a slave. Now, one thing that palace culture, because what we hear a lot in the book is this idea of kind of palace culture, and that's what we see established under the kingdom. So you'll have the court, right? And the court is the cool place to be. That's where you get patronage, right? That's where you get support. So let's say that you are an awesome philosopher, for an awesome mathematician or an awesome scientist. The best way to be supported in this is to get some kind of patronage from a king or a prince living in a palace, right? So this spurs on a lot of competition between people. A lot of people are competing with each other for who is the best at what. And this can lead to some serious innovations, and it does for some time. But we also see that what Alexander did and what outlasted him, because there's a number of legacies that Alexander left that outlasted his relatively short lifetime. And one of the greatest of these is that Alexandrian library that we're talking about. I mean, there's a lot of Alexandrias, though. It should be noted that Alexander really liked to name places after himself. He would come someplace and he'd be like, I see a few trees here. I see a lovely large building here. This seems to me like this is an Alexandria. And then they'd go a few more 100 miles and he'd land someplace else. He'd be like, so there's a river here. There's really low-lying buildings. I really feel like this is an Alexandria. Yeah, there was a lot of Alexander named places and activities and institutions at this time. This was part of his spectacle. This is part of how he spread the myth of himself and made himself powerful and conquered so quickly, is that spectacle. But one of the greatest things that he did was build lots and lots of libraries, because he took with him learned men, because that was part of that Macedonian system. They liked to support people in the palace, and there was that free speech and free thought. He was taught by Aristotle. He had a good and solid respect for thought-based practices. He believed in strategy. He himself had studied the strategies of many generals before him, just as his father had done, as part of that militaristic upbringing. So when he went out into the world, he brought learned men with him, and those learned men along the way established libraries and began collecting. And all of that palace system in these different kingdoms after he died would continue to bring people into palaces that would bring with them new ideas and thoughts that would make their way into libraries. But people traveling to these palaces could themselves also go and visit that local library and be like, look at all this other stuff that other cool people like me are writing. And this meant that a lot of ideas just kind of exploded. Innovations, ideas, thought patterns really changed drastically during the Hellenistic era. We even saw the development of museums, and this was also part of that spectacle too. It was about power, right? So he'd have this great statue of himself, but he'd also have statues from different areas that he invaded, the same way we see in museums today. Museums still to this day, the museums that we have from the modern period, really, when they were enacted, were ways of saying, hey, look, guys, look at how much we conquered via colonialism. The same was true in Alexander's day. It was, look, I stole that statue from the Persians when I defeated them here in Antioch, and I'm going to bring it over to my awesome museum so people can look at it and ooh and ah at the glory that is me. This tradition continued after his death, and it would buttress and promote these localized kingdom systems of power. However, it should be noted that the more that the kingdoms dragged on, the more censorship prevailed. That freedom of speech that we saw in early Macedonian culture is going to erode more and more. It even eroded under Alexander as a leader, but it eroded even more after Alexander's death. So we're going to see a lot of ideas of treason. It was really easy to be put to death for treason if you said the wrong thing at the wrong time in the wrong kingdom. So it was really, really important that these traveling thinkers and great men, when they would visit these various palaces of the kings, that they be really tight-lipped when it came to saying critical things about that king. And we see this reflected in literature that tends to be a little bit more aggrandizing, right? And supporting more of these cultures of elitism at the time. And we'll see this tension arise in certain writers of the time who were promoting pastoralism, which at this time was kind of seen as what poor people did. Remember when we were talking about Xenophon and the nostalgia of the pastoral life, the idyllic life, living out in the countryside was what you wanted to do if you were better off, if you were elite, if you were middle class. You wanted to live out in the countryside at some point. Well, at this point, living out in the countryside meant being a farmer, and being a farmer largely meant being kind of poor. You weren't attached to the city. You weren't attached to the palace. So we're going to see pastoralism kind of become a series of tensions and censorship at this time. We're going to see that confrontation between writers of that pastoral idyllic tradition. But one thing that we're also going to see is that this kind of exposure to new thought forms and some of the crises and the censorship that we see at this time period are going to get people to become more expressive of emotion, of private life, of everyday life. So instead of just talking about ideal forms as we saw much of the time in the Greek Golden Age, it was about idealism, right? It was about being the best. It was about arete. At this point, we see really more of an interplay between idealism and realism, and we're going to see this most adequately expressed in the writing and in the art of this time, especially that visual art like sculpture, where we're going to see people in very different postures and forms than we did in that ideal Greek Golden Age. We're going to see the feminine form become more sensual and sensuous. And we're going to see in both the masculine and the feminine forms more ideas of terror, of tragedy. We're going to see old people in sculptures for the first time. Oh my gosh, old people. But we're also going to see a comedy developed that's a little bit different than what we saw at the end of the Greek Golden Age. Because remember, there's a lot of kind of satirical comedy, right? Because that was critical of the state. But at this time, because there's censorship, that comedy has to move into different areas. So we're going to see the development of the comedy of manners, making fun of the way certain kinds of people behave. So we'll see that develop at this time. In the cities, we definitely see this art form expressed with the way women are represented at this time. We see a lot of these new ideas of the Hellenistic age expressed in the way women are represented, and the way women are able to behave and interact in the metropole, in the city, in that cosmopolitan world. One thing that we saw as an influence of the Macedonians in Greek ideas of women, because we were just talking about those kind of gender roles and the way that they came under a certain amount of tension, right? Under the time period that Xenophon was writing, that may or may not have been expressed in his Socratic writing in the Economicus when he was discussing Isiomachus and his wife. One thing that we see that the Macedonians bring with them is a much more powerful position for women. This held true in some of the kingdoms, though not all. Part of the reason why this held true in a lot of the kingdoms as well was those marriage alliances that we were discussing. Those powerful women that generals would marry in their local customs had to be met by these generals. So we see that women at this time period really come to the forefront in a way they weren't able to in the Greek world. They weren't just operating behind the scenes. They weren't just women, although to say just is to take away some of the power that women had under Greece, especially elite women. But women were able to have broader inheritance rights. They were able to own property. There were more matrilineal marriage rights that we got from sometimes the Macedonians. The Bactrians, for example, had a very strong presence of matrilineal rights. So we see women go into areas that we didn't see them go into before. One way that women of this time period really stepped forward was in the form of writing. Poetry was something that women excelled at in the Hellenistic age, and we see a lot of women poets at this time. And one thing that became very popular at this time period was the epigram. It was a poem written about somebody who had passed, who would be read that would be read at that person's funeral rites. And women really excelled in this at the time period. There's some really great Hellenistic poetry out there that I would definitely encourage you to read. I have a few books myself. Should you ever want to borrow them, come and let me know, and we'll talk about it, and we'll work out arrangements so you don't walk off with my books, because they are, in fact, quite precious to me. But women at this time became very into the arts. They were very much into philosophy, into mathematics, but really the arts is where women excelled the most. And it's partially an expression of these rights that they had. And those rights did have to meet with the Greek world. So marriage contracts became very popular at this time. It was a way of kind of negotiating between former Greek forms of gender roles and the expanded gender roles that we saw when we entered into other kingdoms. We saw this definitely in the Ptolemaic kingdom. We will note later that Cleopatra is the extension of this kind of female leadership that would have been unknown in the Egyptian world before the Greeks came in and before the Hellenistic era. I mean, one thing that we saw with Hatshepsut which is, I know, a ridiculous sounding name, but she was one of the only female pharaohs that there ever was in the kingdoms before that. And that caused a huge stink during that time period, so much so that there's even graffiti scrawled in the walls of caves of the queen getting entered from behind by her manservant as a way of expressing distaste at the idea of female leadership. By the time we enter into the Hellenistic age, female leadership wasn't necessarily a bad thing, and we saw this kind of negotiation expressed through marriage contracts. But we also saw that there was a kind of blending of cultural forms with the feminine ideal that express that cultural synthesis. And we see that here with Queen Arsinoe II, who is one of the Ptolemaic queens. And we see two sculptures of the same woman, a sculpture that was for Greek homes and a sculpture that was for Egyptian homes. This is the same woman presented in two different ways. So we see this cultural synthesis expressed in the way the feminine ideal expanded at this time period. But we also see in general those new forms of representation that we're talking about that get at the emotive and the personal. We see here on the left an old poor woman in the marketplace about to go peddle her wares. We can see here just something that we never would have seen in the Greek Golden Age, right? We see a woman who is incredibly, incredibly old. She's wrinkled. You see one of her breasts sagging and hanging out of her garment. You see the musculature that you would have seen on a poorer woman, never on an elite woman. So we see poor people expressed more in our sculpture. We see people in states of despair, of agony, of toil, right? Because this woman is going to the market, but we also see that here. We see the age, the lines. Look at just the sheer number of lines here. Look at the facial expressions, almost an agony promoted here. We see men shown in their age with no fancy, awesome hairdos that made them idealistic. This man has lines on his face. He is grizzled. You see his age, and people thought of this as being a more normal art form at this time. We never would have seen this in the Greek Golden Age, the way it really kind of idealized youth as the expression of arete and excellence, the best time of life. That time of arete and excellence has given way more into a more quotidian, everyday representation. But we also see that we represent others more. And this, of course, makes sense because we see other people more. As we see here, a Gaul. This is a Gaul who has just been defeated. He has just killed his wife, and he is now killing himself rather than being taken alive by the enemy. This is a really drastic and hideous scene. We never would have seen this in the Greek Homeric kind of idealistic sculpture. Or we see Laocoon and his sons, right? Who are beset by snakes who are killing them. We see the look of agony in his face. We see him dying with his sons nearby. These kinds of scenes would not have been expressed in the Greek Golden Age like this. They weren't idealistic. No, this was more of realism. And it got at some of the tensions at the time, but it also got into this new form of cultural interaction and exposure. This barbarian here would never have been represented by the Greeks because he never would have been considered important enough to make for sculpture. But now we see that the other is just as important as that Greek idea of the gods and representations of people who were more like the gods. And we also saw that with exposure to the Near East, especially in the Bactrian empires, right? We saw near those empires that were bordering on India, some suffusion of some ideas that were coming out of India at the time. India had just before this gone through a period called the heterodoxy period. The heterodoxies were all of the religions that came out that were not uh, old school Dravidian Vedic Hinduism. The heterodoxies were Jainism and Buddhism, and later we'll see Sikh religions forming, and all of these will come through the Hellenistic kingdoms, their ideas, their art forms, their texts. As the Greek people move in to these kingdoms and are exposed to these other concepts because of hegemony, because we're attaching our concepts of the Greek world onto your existing forms of culture, we're going to see that influence Greek forms, but we're also going to see Greek forms influence the other way those Indian forms. And we see this with the Gandharan Buddhas. The Gandhara Buddhas who start to have these Greek clothing types, right? We see the robes that are draped in this very specific manner. Before that, we saw Buddha in a very, very, very simple and much more Indian / Northern Indian, Kshatriyan clothing form, so it would have been very simple. He was mostly naked with much less than a loincloth, especially when he's sitting under the Bodhi tree, because that's during his aesthetic period, right? But at this time, we start to see Buddhist sculpture take on some of these Greek art forms, the same way Greek art forms started to take on some of the characteristic of Buddhist art forms, some of these emotional characteristics. We'll also see the development of the sensual stomach in Indian art forms. It's considered manly to have the sensual stomach, a little bit of a pooch, a little bit of a pot belly is considered to be manly, right? And we'll see this really become influential in some of the Greek art forms as we'll see pot bellies making appearances on men in a way they wouldn't have in the Greek Golden Age, when men all looked like they were chiseled and airbrushed a la 300, right? So we're going to see these art forms reflect on each other. Even the frieze art form that was very popular, this frieze right here with all of these lovely little scenes that are all interacting around a central figure. This was very popular in the Buddhist world. We'll see that make its way over into the Greek world in the way story frames are told in sculpture. And we're going to see, you know, this kind of back and forth between the two cultures. So we see a lot of synthesis at this time period. But we're also going to see that synthesis in the intellectual world, especially when it came to like philosophy, medicine, and mathematics. We're going to see the rise of materialism. Now, what do we mean by materialism? Now, there's a few different philosophical ideas that we can attach to materialism that come throughout the ages. What we mean at this time period when we discuss materialism is that we're moving away from that kind of metaphysics that we saw in Plato, right? The forms, these kind of existential being. And though we have some existentialism, and certainly we have a lot of kind of metaphysical ideas that synthesize from that Gandharan revolution in India coming in influencing and being influenced by Greek ideas of metaphysics, we see the development of this notion of the physical world. The physical world is the ultimate world, that everything is expressed in some material form that can be observed. And this is what we see a lot at this time, especially with the development of this notion of ethics. We started to see this in Socrates. We saw it a little bit more, though, with Aristotle, the notion that there is an observed method of arriving at an ethical system. But unlike Socrates, these materialistic philosophies of the time really went past the idea of some universal notion of ethics that we are born with, and really more of natural ethics that progress from the environment in which we live. But we also see a further development of this notion of the logos. Now, people tend to think of logos as just word or the word. We see it in the Bible. In the beginning, there's the word, right? What we see that loosely translated from is this idea of logos. It should be noted that logos means much more than that. It's ideas, wisdom, philosophy. It's knowing things. The knowing of things becomes the most fruitful endeavor, and knowing things requires observation. But we also see people turning this not just upon the natural observable world, but on themselves, upon the personal world in a way that we didn't see before. We see, how do we think about personal ethics and happiness? Aristotle really explored ideas of how to be happy. He talked about different things that people need to do and avoid to gain happiness. And one way that Aristotelian thought and post-Aristotelian thought was influenced by the East, and how the East was bringing in these notions from especially Buddhism and Jainism, was this notion that happiness was avoiding extremes. And this certainly made sense for the people of the Hellenistic era, as they came out of a time period of great war and finally came into an era where there was much less in the way of war and disruption, even though there was some disruption after Alexander. People had a much more kind of put together lives. It was more predictable. That being the case, people could think about how to be happy, and one thing that you could do to be happy is avoid extremes. So we see this developing in the philosophy of this time period, but we also see that philosophy begins to be separated from science. So when we're thinking about philosophy and the pursuit of ethics, that would be a different study than the study of science when we're observing the natural world and talking about systems in the natural world, right? So we see this expressed a lot in ideas of spatial arrangements. And we saw this even with the way that people like Alexander developed siege warfare and weapons. They needed a way to apply science in the real world. And these palace systems made it really possible for scientists to thrive under these conditions. We also saw that math explodes as a consequence of this. We see geometry and astronomy being promoted more, and that makes sense. You need geometry if you're going to come up with a catapult that can shoot a nasty plagued animal into a sieged city. You need geometry to do that. So these had practical applications. Many of them were military, but some of them had to do with geography. Alexander the Great was really about mapping the world, not just conquering it, but understanding it and mapping it. We talked about those learned men that he brought with him. This persisted even after his death in the kingdoms with the palace system. You had to have these kinds of practical applications. We wanted to understand the world we were in, and we had to do that when the world became a bigger place. So it's good to be able to chart the skies and the stars because you use them to navigate in a much larger world. We also saw medicine explode, and a big reason why this happened was because the exposure to the Egyptian world. One thing that the Egyptians had been doing for a very, very long time was mummification. Mummification required vivisection and dissection of corpses. This was something that was considered macabre and horrid to the Greeks during the Golden Age. However, more exposure in the Hellenistic era to the Ptolemaic kingdoms and that existing Egyptian knowledge meant a greater exposure to the body and a greater acceptance of that exposure to the body and systems of the body. So we saw a really big explosion in medicinal science, especially as we were moving more and more away from ethical and value systems based solely upon the gods and the workings of the gods. We didn't need auguries and auspices and oracles to tell us how the world worked and how the body worked. Hippocrates kind of began this in the Greek world, but it really exploded far after him. We also saw the development of things like clocks, right? So we needed certain mathematical principles to have clocks run. The more you have a large administrative system, the more you need your numbers to work in a way that's universal. So the more we needed this, the more that it kind of exploded, the more people were exposed to mathematics from other cultures because, as we noted, the Persians this whole time had their own palace system where they encouraged mathematicians. And we saw how some of those mathematical ideas, like the concept of zero, made people so crazy in the Greek Golden Age that they're willing to knife fight each other over the concept of zero. This is a very different world in the Hellenistic world. The idea of zero makes much more sense in the Hellenistic world, in a world that's bigger, in a world where we saw all of our values attached to these constants and these commons collapse. The more we see these systems expand. Now let's kind of get at some of the major philosophical ideas of the time, and we're not going to really spend a whole heck of a lot of time on these because your book kind of does a really great idea of going into the major mechanics of this. And I'd certainly suggest that if you guys are interested in this as a topic, that's great. We definitely go for the further readings and delve more directly into this. But I would also suggest a great thing to do is to take a philosophy class because it's a really wonderful way to understand some of these ideas that were coming out at the time, because you will cover this in a foundational first year college philosophy course. And so I definitely recommend that. But let's just touch on some of the basic ideas here. So the Epicureans were an interesting branch of folks. Epicurus, the founder of the Epicureanism, allowed slaves and women into his school. Again, we see this radical break with the Athenian Golden Age. He believed that all people should be exposed to knowledge. He even said that this was broken down on a linguistic level. Even the idea of wisdom was a feminine word. Why shouldn't women be allowed into this practice? He believed in atomistic materialism. Though it should be noted that Epicurus took a lot from other thinkers that had come before him. Probably one of the most influential at this time was Democritus. However, Epicurus kind of took this idea and ran with it. The idea being that all things are made up of divisible material pieces, what we would consider atoms, right? And we call that atomistic. At the time, they wouldn't have called that atomistic. They had different words for it. However, the idea is that we're all made up of a bunch of divisible material parts. Now, usually when we think of Epicurus, a lot of what people think of is hedonism. But it's not hedonism in the sense it just ain't eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. The idea is that it's rational. You do not deny yourself pleasures simply because they're pleasurable. There's not some asceticism that you should expose yourself to. You should do things that make you feel good, but the reasons and the boundaries of that is when you are destructive to yourself or the people around you. So happiness was giving yourself pleasure to the point where it wasn't destructive. Now, Stoicism was kind of the opposite of Epicureanism, and these two schools of thought did tend to butt heads, sometimes even physically on the streets, because sometimes philosophers were known to duke it out on the streets. It did happen sometimes, folks. People got very upset about ideas at this time. It should be known. It still happened. But his idea was that the fates really compelled most things. He still believed in that notion of the fates. He was kind of reviving some of these classical Athenian Golden Age forms. But he did believe that people should have an ethics that girded their daily lives, that you should have an ethic that creates a standard for the way you behave every day. And that should be in harmony with the divine. He also was a bit of a xenophobic person. He believed that they should be isolationists, so he believed that there shouldn't be too much exposure to the outside world because it would sully the ethics that we have on our personal everyday life, and it would interfere with the way the gods interact in our life. He believed that you should avoid extremes, right? So we don't want to be too pleasurable like the Epicureans are, because too much pleasure is a problem. Because happiness really is being a virtuous person, being good to your fellow man, something that we arrive at by a divine given system of ethics. And he did teach to both women and men, but they were upper class and elite by and large. Now there was Pythagoras, and Pythagoras is probably one of the most interesting cats to come out of the Hellenistic world, and he really girds the gap between the Athenian age of the 30 tyrants and the Hellenistic world. He really believed that philosophy should be, and ideas of mathematics should be experienced religiously because math was a religious notion. He was exposed to Babylonian ideas, most especially the notion of zero, right? And he was also exposed from those Eastern Hellenistic kingdoms to those heterodoxies that were promoting an idea of reincarnation. And we should say the soul, I put this in quotes because there's no real concept of the soul. There's not a concept of a soul in any of these Indian religions. It's not the soul the way we think of it in the Christian sense. It would really be more like the fire as it's expressed in Jainism, in Hinduism, and in Buddhism. It is a fire that's connected to larger fires that can be blown out. Ahimsa being the Jainist expression of that, the blowing out of the flame. This is some eternal part of self that is detachable to a point, but is in fact attached to a greater and wider web that attaches to all things in the universe. So it's not terribly separable, it's only seemingly separable by our relative perspective. So you think of yourself as having your own soul, much the same way perhaps an organ in your body is separable from the rest of your body. So yes, I have a heart, but that heart is not separable from the rest of my body. Obviously, if you pulled the heart out, the rest of my body would die. They're all part of one body. That's how we can kind of see that notion of quote unquote the soul. It's not an individual soul as we see in Christianity. It is a soul connected to a larger body. But he did believe in the eternal, the reincarnation, and he did enforce dietary restrictions. Again, this was the influence of the heterodoxies like Jainism that introduced asceticism that was very popular in Pythagorean rituals. So he believed that self-discipline, to starve yourself, to deprive yourself of certain things so you can see greater and more wonderful things in the universe, most specifically mathematics, because he was very into the sacred mathematic, that this happened through self-discipline, that if you deprived yourself of certain things uh, to gain the purpose of insight, that would lead to happiness. Then there were the skeptics. The skeptics really began like Pythagoras in the reign of the 30 tyrants, and they also were influenced by aesthetics, but they really were a little bit less divine, ritualistic, and mythic than we see the Pythagoreans. We see the skeptics kind of I interrogate the notion of one particular truth. So they had a kind of more conversational idea of philosophy, that we arrived at truth by having these kinds of deep, meaningful conversations with each other where we interrogate each other's notions of truth until we break free of the concept of there being one universal truth. Then we had the cynics. The cynics rejected a lot of those kinds of concepts of virtue and convention as being, or virtue being tied to convention, traditions, the way things are done. They said no, the way that you arrive at virtue is by denying yourself of those comforts that make it difficult for you to see the truth and real virtue in the world. That comforts make people soft, and thus they do not have virtue. That and that's kind of the illusion of tradition and virtue in the way that it's tied to it is something that we want to get away from. That virtue actually comes from a state of nature, and that the opposite of that is the shame that one feels, right? We feel shame when when we look upon our natural state of being. One thing that the cynics did that they were kind of famous for was not be particularly careful about things like bathing or have fancy clothing or any of those trappings of wealth or status, because they believed that those actually promoted the opposite of happiness and the opposite of any true virtue, because virtue isn't really a thing, it's an illusion. Now here's the fun stuff. Now we get into good old science, right? We saw a lot of fabulous inventions at the time. Sadly, some of them didn't really gain, and I am making a pun here, the steam they could have, because they didn't have much in the way of a practical application. Nowhere is this more true than Hero's steam engine, built all the way back here during the Hellenistic kingdoms. He really was trying to create a hydrostatic balance so he could power ships in and out of ports and make sure that ports were more safe places for boats to dock, because that could be a problem in the Mediterranean Sea. As we discussed, that warm seaport could be disastrous, especially around the Dardanelles, where weather can be highly unpredictable. It's part of why Homeric epics were so filled with people in boats trying not to crash along the Dardanelles. It was difficult sometimes in these warm seaports. And that was the idea he was trying to solve, and he wasn't really able to solve it with the steam engine. So sadly, the steam engine really didn't gain any traction, and it was only years and years and years after the steam engine was reinvented in the 1800s that people were like, oh my gosh, that was so amazing. Somebody did it that long ago. Yes, yes, we had Archimedes who tried to also solve this puzzle, the same one that Hero did with his steam engine, with the hydrostatic balance machine, which again didn't make much in the way of traction, but later it would be both of these inventions would be parts of the Industrial Revolution. So it just goes to show you that a good idea needs the time and the place in which it can occur. Because really at this time there were a lot of ideas that did gain traction, and much of them came from these transcultural innovations. We saw the development of systolic and diastolic ideas of blood pressure come out of India, largely because their tradition, the Vedic tradition that then got even expanded upon under the heterodoxies, under the ascetic traditions of Jainism and the meditative tradition of Buddhism. This idea of blood pressure was attached to this notion of meditation. So people would take their pulse to moderate and monitor the way they were speeding up and slowing down their body in order to attain certain states of mental clarity. That was very influential on the medicinal world of the Greeks. And as we noted, the Egyptians brought in dissection and vivisection in a way that exposed things like the nervous system, right? And Mesopotamia also had a tradition of vivisection, which they got a little bit from the Egyptians. The Egyptians got a little bit from them. There was a little bit of transcultural transmission there. And that developed this notion of the nervous system. Now, we already discussed a little bit, but let's bring this back up. Then in Syria, Turkey, Anatolia, and Iran, a lot of health spas and baths, which is, by the way, where the Romans are going to get their famous baths, were places where medicine took place. One thing that we saw in these areas were things like the first ever real vaccines. So in Syria especially, and it's possible that they got this from Anatolia, though Iran does take credit for this, and it's not quite certain who did it first. But we do know from some records from the time that people at baths in Syria would take the scabs from sores that people would get from a not so bad plague, a plague where people got sick but not as many people died. We take the people who didn't die, peel the scabs off of their infections. Then people would come into the bath, they would cut their arm, they would smack that scab on it, and they would wrap it up and they'd let them get infected with that less virulent form of the disease so they'd have an immunity. Now, this was years and years and years and years, obviously, before vaccines were made in Western Europe. So it's pretty exciting, some of the cultural innovations. Not all of these gained traction in the Western world after the Hellenistic kingdom, but during the period of the Hellenistic kingdom, these practices became more popular. And in fact, more people wanted things like baths and spas to go and have medicine enacted, to have cleansing rituals. And cleansing rituals were a really good thing to have for medicine, still are to this day, a really good thing to have for medicine. But we also see the religion of this time period intersecting, as well as the philosophy, the mathematics, and the science. And we see this especially with kind of cults. At this time, a whole heck of a lot of cults that pre-exist at this time flourished. Cults from one area became more popular in other areas. One of the most premier cults is the cult of Isis that would last through the Greek world and into the Roman world. Actually, the cult of Isis is going to pop up in some way, shape, or form all the way into the 3rd century CE. We're going to see the cult of Isis be very popular in many parts of the Mediterranean. So too was the cult of Mithras, which may have come from that Mycenaean cult. We're talking a little bit about the bull cult, right? That may have been part of that pre-existing religion that existed before Judaism, before Greek religions, that's somewhat mysterious to us because it's during the Dark Ages. That may be where the cult of Mithras came from. But we also started to see cults kind of forming around the idea of the kings. These are going to be very influential for the imperial cult that pops up in Rome later. And these cults really reinforced ideas of social order and hierarchy in society. But we also see that a lot of deities from different religions will be combined under the same cults, right? So you'll see, people go into a cult space and worship Mithras, Isis, and maybe a king all in the same cult location. You see these kinds of things rubbing up against each other. People would go to cults for a whole number of things. They'd go to them for cures for diseases through magic rituals, to guide them through prognostications. So, can you predict what will happen for me in the future? Can you look at these signs and omens that I see and tell me what they mean about my life and what I'm suffering under? You would definitely see women very present in certain cults, especially the cult of Isis. And this was connected to rites of fertility, to female empowerment in some way, shape, or form. And if you look at Isis as a figure in Egypt, you'll see some of the concepts attached to Isis that flowed into that cult. But we'll also see a heavier emphasis on the fates, which makes a lot of sense after all of the disruption of that kind of ordered, value-laden, traditional Greek world. But we'll also see Judaism as a religion expand during this time period because the Jewish people are all throughout this Hellenistic kingdom. And during the Hellenistic kingdom, they're able to prosper and get along much more than they had for many years before that, outside of the time period they spent under the Persians. Now, it should be noted that the Hellenistic world was not as kind to the Jewish people as the Persian world had been. Nonetheless, we see new forms and ideas start to kind of come up in Judaism. We see the Torah oral tradition really expand and spread into more areas. We see Greek influences on traditions and even on wording, like logos as a concept was very powerful to the Jewish people, and they really, really jived with that very well. We also saw the temple continue to grow and expand. However, for a short period, the Greeks and the Jewish people come to a head with each other again over Jerusalem, largely, and practices in Jerusalem. So we're going to see again the development of that apocalypticism that we saw in chapter 2 that usually kind of evolves. This idea of the end of the world tends to come about whenever Jerusalem, the temple, is threatened and worship at the temple is threatened. But even though worship at the temple is threatened, the spread of small religious practices like the synagogue are really going to find their voice more during this time. So all of this is going to lead us into the next few chapters. We've really kind of come to the end of the Hellenistic world, and we're not going to be revisiting the Greeks for a while. In the next few chapters, what we're going to be dealing with is the Roman world, and then we're going to get into the rise of Christianity. One thing that should be noted is that chapter 5 and 6 occur at the same time as chapter 3 and 4. So as we see the Roman world continue to develop, it's developing in tandem to many of these events. The end of the Hellenistic kingdom is really when we start to see the Roman world begin to expand. And in fact, as the kingdoms, the Hellenistic kingdoms, begin to kind of collapse and not really be as strong as they once were because a series of debt crises, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into our chapters on Rome. There's a few kind of events that happen weather-wise and world-wise that lead to some disruption in the Hellenistic world. And that may, by the way, be a contributing factor to some of these emotive forms in the Hellenistic world. But as that happens, we're going to see the Roman Empire kind of begin to occupy a lot of these kingdoms. So many of these kingdoms will persist until the Roman Empire comes and takes over. So this is something to keep in your mind, that what we're seeing here is going to be in tandem with the growth and the development of the Roman Empire, especially in the later half of the Republic. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I'll see you again for Chapter 5.